Ready. I am just checking in the folks online and then I'll check in the folks on person and then we will get started. Today, we're going to continue our discussion. And then I have some fun stuff about birth control and stuff like that that we'll cover as well. Just be careful out there, y'all. I now know of 2 people who have tested positive for COVID in the past couple days, so it's definitely going around again. So just take good care of yourselves. You know what I should do? I'm making this way too hard on myself. If I list the participants, it shows them in alphabetical order. That's a lot easier. Okay. And again, once again, I want to thank the folks who are Zooming in, especially if you are sick. We appreciate you taking care of yourselves and taking care of us. So thank you. All righty. Kind of just look around and see who's here today. Okay, awesome. All right, so we're going to continue our discussion. And so I'll do the same thing I did the other day, where we'll have the folks on Zoom go into a couple breakout rooms. And then the folks in here, you can just kind of group up with people around you to talk about them for a couple minutes. And then we'll come back together. So this is the first one we're going to talk about today. I'll copy paste it into the chat for our Zoom people, because once they're in breakout rooms, they can't see it. I don't know what just happened. There we go. But where did you learn about sexual behaviors? How did you know what to do and what to think about it? Who was influential in your life as talking about sex ed? And as adults, how do you want your own children learning about sex? So again, folks in class, you can start chatting, and I'm going to go ahead and put our Zoom folks into a couple breakout rooms here. Put you guys in like 3 breakout rooms today, so you have smaller groups. So give me just a second. Cool. All right, I'm going to open the rooms. Yeah, folks in the back, Lyric, Alex, come on and move so you can talk to some people. Yes, thank you. Oop, there you go. All right, so take just another minute or two, and then I'll bring everybody back.
So I kind of don't know. I know, but I'm not naive to it.
Alrighty, gonna bring our breakout room folks back in about 10 seconds here.
Yeah.
Alrighty, welcome back, folks. This will be a little disjointed. Definitely feel free to participate in the chat. Or if anyone wants to unmute, that's okay too. Alrighty, so where did y'all learn about sex or sexual behaviors? Where did you learn those scripts? Yeah. Parents, good. Yeah, not a lot of parents give comprehensive sex ed, so that's excellent. School, yeah, also excellent. Yeah. Yeah, I have actually my oldest friend that we've been friends since 4th grade. That's how she learned. It was just like, she's like, remember when like someone had a book in like 6th grade on the playground and we were reading it? She's like, that's how I learned about sex. And I'm like, it's like, wow, okay, that's a different way to have that happen, right? Yeah. All right. And who has been influential in your life with regard to sex ed? Parents again, yeah. How about anybody's siblings or, yeah, older siblings? And then as adults, how do you want your kiddos, your hypothetical kiddos to learn about sex?
I said making like a comfortable environment so that when they get to that age of like questioning things or being confused, that they can like feel comfortable coming to me and asking questions. And then I would like think metaphors about things, so just kind of say what it is.
Yeah.
That way, like when they say like ask about it, I feel like metaphors make people uncomfortable to saying what actually is going on. So like just saying what it is so that they know it's not like something to be ashamed of or anything.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point that like metaphors can be kind of like misleading, right? Inaccurate. Yeah. Lorraine says in the chat, I learned in school because they made everyone take sex ed, but they mostly talked about STDs and condoms. Yeah, I think that's sort of what sex ed ends up focusing on, right? They show you those really gruesome pictures of STIs to try to like scare you, right? Don't have sex, so this will happen. Like that if you have safe sex and have conversations with your partner about being tested, right? Yeah, other thoughts about how you would want your kiddos learning about sex?
Also, based on the parent, if they really want to know, because sometimes children are curious and they have feelings. So it depends on if they want to talk about it and try not to be uncomfortable. So depending on the parent, if they really want to talk about it, then they eventually come out.
Yeah, that's such a good point, that like a lot of this ends up being you having to work on yourself, right, as a parent, so that you can feel comfortable talking about these things. Yeah, I know that in addition to schools, some churches will have sex ed as well. So the denomination I belong to has a program they call Our Whole Lives that like gets started in elementary school and go all the way to adulthood and is like geared toward each developmental level. So at the youngest age, you might just be talking about like different people have different parts and here are the names for them, right? And then you kind of move through that. I actually have a great book that we've been using called From Diapers to Dating about how you talk about this stuff with your kiddos. And we're at the stage right now where that's what we're doing. It's like giving everything the proper names. It's not like a hoo-ha, right? It's a vulva, it's a vagina, it's a penis. And then also talking about how different people have different organs. Funny story. So we have, my daughter is part of a book club that sends books that talk about, it's called Little Feminist Book Club, but it's mostly books about diverse characters or topics that are hard to talk about. And so there's one called The Bare Naked Book that's just about like bodies. And we were reading it once, and of course it happens to be, she wants to read it like while my conservative father and grandfather are over. And we're talking about, she says, okay, so mom and Quinn have a vulva and dad has, she stops, she goes, dad has a butt. It's like, well, everybody has a butt. So sort of like, but I'm just like having this conversation more than I ever had sex ed wise with my dad, I think, so. Alrighty, did you have sex ed when you were in school? Sounds like a bunch of you did. And do you think it was effective? Why or why not? So I'm gonna, again, throw our folks into breakout rooms for just a minute or two and chat through that one. Talk about good things, bad things that you ran into. What worked, what was really bad?
They need to know too, like, the one who's not real good. Also, the bad part of it is the experience and not quantity. Yeah. So, this is like a way to- and maybe tell people.
Alrighty, I'm gonna bring my other folks back here. Alrighty. All right, so what was everyone's experience with sex ed? Did everybody have sex ed in school? Did anybody not have sex ed in school? So no sex ed in school whatsoever, geez. Yeah, and that can happen, right? And we know that there are places that don't offer any of it. We know that there are places that only offer abstinence only sex ed. Did anyone have abstinence only sex ed? Yeah, several people. I had really comprehensive sex ed, like to an unusual degree. We had a very, I went to a private school and we had a very energetic gym teacher who like had us do skits about different types of contraception. And like one of my friends was Sponge Man. But literally I've talked to hundreds of students over the years, colleagues, no one has had anything like that. So I was definitely an outlier. Yeah, so a lot of people still have abstinence only sex ed. So what were some good things that those of you who did have sex ed, what worked?
Sort of taught you how to understand just like the body a little bit better. At least for me, we had it at a time where like everyone started to hit puberty, like 6th, 7th grade, and it sort of mostly focused on that. I would say like just the body itself rather than being on.
Yeah, and I know that happened to me. Yeah, I think like 4th or 5th grade, we just had a like, girls are gonna get periods, and this is what happens to boys. Although, of course, we were split by gender, and that was pretty helpful to kind of know, like, oh, this is what's coming, right? What were other things that worked well for other folks?
They're gonna do it regardless. It's like they teach you, but they're still gonna be curious in this life. But learn the hard way. But it's gonna be worth time to the students. They're going to actually try to be curious.
Yeah, and maybe it won't surprise folks, but places that don't have sex ed or don't have or have abstinence only sex ed, have higher rates of teen pregnancy and have higher rates of STIs because folks are just not learning about how to protect themselves. Can anyone have like egregious stories of sex ed gone wrong? Things being really uncomfortable? But that's good. No one seems traumatized. So that's good. Alrighty. This one we kind of already talked about. So we're going to skip ahead here. So what do you think that someone who was, and we can expand this to be LGBTQ plus, right? Which if you're not familiar with that acronym is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, and then that also includes asexual and whatnot in the description. So what do you think a person who is not straight basically would say about the origin of their sexual orientation? Do you think that they would emphasize environmental or biological factors? And do you think they'd feel comfortable talking about those factors? And I'll just say with a caveat that science doesn't have good answers to this yet. So this is more about how individual people feel. So I'm gonna go ahead and throw our friends in breakout rooms and go ahead and think about identity and how we define identity right now. And is it, you're born this way, or is it socialization, or a mix of both?
Like just because you have straight or gay parents. I think that that's biological.
Just have a second thought about it.
Alrighty, so I'm hearing quiet. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Go back to sharing and bring our folks back to the breakout rooms. Alrighty. So yeah, as I mentioned at the start of this lecture, language is evolving. I believe this lecture was created sometime in the early 2010s. That is definitely not excusing some of the older language that's being used here. But certainly I've been trying to update it as we go through. So thank you for your understanding as I do that. And remember, the links to these updated Google slides are all on Blackboard where the PDFs are posted as well. So what do folks think? How do people feel about sexual orientation? Does it come from environmental factors, biological factors, some sort of combination of both? What do you think? Yeah, why not?
I just don't think you raise a man who is straight with playing with Barbie dolls, or for example, my dad, he grew up, he has one younger brother, but he is a lot younger, so he basically grew up with three sisters, and they would dress them up in like Barbie foot or like ballerina stuff, like making our tutus, like all like put all the stuff. And like it didn't like just like make my dad become like part of the LGBTQ. Like it doesn't like it's like make someone be gay or make someone be straight. And I think same thing, like if a man who is you couldn't not to like stereotype like typical boy or girls toys, but like you give them like trucks, baseballs, and all that stuff. Like it's not going to be straight when he grows up. So
Right, yeah, and there is evidence of like kids who are more nurturing. If you do give them trucks or cars, they just treat them like baby dolls. And they'll like put them to bed and things like that. And again, that could be girls or boys or someone with the gender identity in between. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think that really points out some of the problems we have. Yeah.
I think environment doesn't necessarily what your sexual orientation is, but definitely have an impact. If your environment is more accepting, explore yourself earlier, kind of like develop more, but you're not as accepting, kind of like push back and develop that.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, and this is why there are resources like the Trevor Project, for example, which is specifically to help LGBTQ plus youth who are suicidal or feeling like, because unfortunately that rate is really high among members of that community for the reasons that Sarah was just saying. The idea that like, yeah, environment isn't gonna make you gay or straight or what have you, but it is going to determine whether or not you feel comfortable and safe expressing who you are, right? Yeah, I think that's such a good point. Yeah, and I think that, did you have something? Okay, oh, good. I was like, I saw a hand. I don't want to miss anybody out. Let me just check the chat real quick. Doesn't look like anybody threw anything in there. I just wanted to do that. Okay, last set of questions here. Is it a mental illness to be gay or lesbian? It was once considered that way. And do we need more than two gender roles or none at all? Rather than going into groups, we can just chat about this one. So what do you all think about the idea that being gay used to be a mental illness? It was actually classified with the sexual disorders, with the paraphilias, which are things like fetishism, pedophilia, things along those lines. Yeah, I know. I see somebody like, what? Yeah, it feels really weird, but until the 70s, it was considered a mental illness. Why do you think that was? Why did we classify it that way? Yeah, I think that that's a, yeah, no, I think that's such a good point. Other thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
Someone was different. Like a lot of times, especially at that time, where it kind of stuck in the ways.
No, I think that's such a good point. Yeah, and there's something too, and I mean, this is an argument that we have in modern clinical psych as well, is the idea that anyone who's different is somehow pathological, right? I think this is something we struggle with. How do we define who has a mental disorder, and how do we define someone who might just be reacting normally to a really bad situation, right? Like one of the controversial things they changed in the most recent version of the manual we use for diagnosis was, it used to be if you were grieving, like a lost loved one, you couldn't be diagnosed with depression until you were 6 months along, sort of acknowledging that like it's natural to grieve. And they took that 6-month requirement away. And the argument was so people could get treatment sooner if it was really interfering with their lives. But what that can be read at is that grief is pathological, right? That like it's not okay to experience strong emotions when someone close to you dies. And clearly that's not the case, right? So this is something that as psychologists, we grapple with all the time. So yeah, obviously in the 70s, they took this away. That doesn't mean psychology has been perfect with this. So until fairly recently, and in fact, some people still do it, people were implementing what's called conversion therapy. So these are therapies where you try to make someone straight, basically, or make someone who's trans, cisgendered. And there's a lot of harm that's been done from those. As you can imagine, for those of you who are straight, imagine if someone said, I'm going to put you through therapy so that you become queer, right? It just doesn't work. That's not who you are. And so a lot of people ended up with PTSD as a result of that. And psychologists are finally, like within the past 10 years, issuing statements and saying, we're sorry, we messed people up. But again, it's like, why did it take you so long to figure that out, right? So that's problematic. And we still have issues. So they've changed it a little, but there's still a diagnosis that can be given to people who are essentially just trans. And it's called gender dysphoria now. It used to be called gender identity disorder. So I think this is problematic because we're really diagnosing someone with a disorder because society is projecting them, right? But that being said, I am a cisgender straight white woman, and I need to be aware of, what people who are not me are saying. And I've talked to trans advocates who say, like, we need this diagnosis because unless you're diagnosed with gender dysphoria, your insurance won't cover things like hormones like testosterone, and they won't cover surgical things. So for now, we need it. Ideally, in the future, we won't need to pathologize somebody to have them get gender confirming treatments. All right, what do we think about gender roles? Should we have like 5 or 10 different gender roles, or should we just do away with them altogether? Again, I don't have a good answer to this.
Yeah, it can depend on like person to person.
Mhm.
Like, I don't think that we should have like extreme gender roles. Like, I wouldn't be curious if a man was like, oh, you're a woman. Like, obviously, like, I don't know anyone that would say this, but like, I shouldn't like go to college, or like I should just be at home and like cook and clean. Like, I would love to be a stay-at-home wife, but like, I think a man can also do that.
Right.
And then I think it's also like, can be like, not pick and choose, but like, I do like the idea of like someone being like a gentleman, but I also think that like someone being like a good person.
Right.
Like in the door or whatever, but I don't think it should be like extreme. I don't think it's bad to have just like the little ones, but I think they can flip flop, because I think most of them are just like being like a good, clean person.
Right.
Like, I don't think it's like man or woman.
It's actually really funny you say like being a clean person, because a few years back, myself and then a couple of my professors from undergrad did a study to try to create a measure of self-sexualization. So it's just like seeing yourself as a sexual being, and like some research suggests this could actually be really powerful. And so many of the behaviors people endorsed were just basic hygiene. It was like, I shave, or I take a shower, I put on cologne or perfume, or I put on deodorant, I think was one of them. And it was like, wow, like, I guess that's cool that makes you feel sexy, but shouldn't you be doing that even when you don't feel sexy, right? One would hope. But yeah, I think that's such a good point, right? That like, there are probably good behaviors we can get from all the gender roles, and probably everybody should just be doing those. Yeah, so just things to think about. So some fun stuff to bring in here. So this is what's called the Kinsey scale. So if you remember, we were talking about motivation, we mentioned Kinsey, and he did those large scale studies about human sexuality and sexual motivation. And he conceptualized sexuality as a continuum. And now he came up with this, I want to say in the 40s, so certainly this is outdated now. And we know that it's not just like one end to another end. It's more the genderbread person, where you can kind of like be on different scales. But it's sort of interesting to think about. He came up with the idea of like, people tend to think you're either a 0 or a 6, exclusively heterosexual or exclusively homosexual. But he said, a lot of people kind of fall in between. And he actually said himself that he fell in between, that he had some attraction to men, but he was married to a woman and that was his primary sexual attraction. This has been used in weird ways over the years. Like I remember I review manuscripts for journals. I'm one of the peer reviewers who helps with the scientific process. And I remember reviewing an article that tried to argue that anyone who wasn't a 0 or 6 should be identified as bisexual. And I was like, I don't know about that, right? I think those terms are things that like people themselves should use, and we should respect what people label themselves. So for example, when I ask about sexual orientation on my questionnaires that I give, I will list a bunch of categories and say, choose the one you think best applies to you. And then I'll say like, no, but like, how would you actually define your sexuality? And like, a lot of times people just say straight, gay, lesbian, things like that. But like, sometimes you say things like, I just am attracted to people, or I think someone wrote, I like penises. Like, awesome, that's how you define your sexuality, good for you, right? And so there is this idea that there's a continuum, and the genderbread person has expanded on this. All right, some other interesting stats here. So this is from a twin study, and just sort of backing up. One of the reasons we study twins a lot, I have a friend who has twins, and basically like as soon as they were born, she was contacted by like university hospitals, like, do you want to be in twin studies? Is because we know that identical twins, which are also called monozygotic twins, have the exact same genetic material. They come from the same sperm and same egg, that just at early point in development, it made 2 zygotes instead of 1. So they are going to share the same uterus, share the same genetic material, and then also share the same environment growing up. Fraternal twins are 2 eggs, 2 sperm. And so genetically, they're no more similar than any other sibling. They just happen to, again, come up in the same uterus, be raised in the same environment. And so if we look at differences between identical twins, like how much they are alike, and fraternal twins, we can often get a feel for essentially how much genetics are playing into this. So concordance rate here, let me, because I can't even read this and I'm right in front of the screens. I'm just going to change this caption to be black text. Give me just a second here. There we go. All right. So concordance means that the twins share that feature. Like it would be like both twins identified as gay, for example. And so essentially they've looked at gay men and lesbian women, and there are higher concordance rates among identical twins than fraternal twins. And then fraternal twins have higher concordance rates. So that would mean both twins identify the same sexual orientation than adopted siblings. The reason we might look at adoptive siblings is because they're raised in the same environment, but in theory, they don't share a genetic code, right? And so if we're trying to kind of rule out environment, that's a nice way to do it. So these are consistent with the hypothesis that genetic factors influence sexual orientation. But there's also environmental factors that come into play. And I think probably a lot of this has to do with what Sarah was saying, that even within the same household, right, there might be a twin who's like more confident coming out, things along those lines. And also, you can have the same genes, the same attraction, but define it a different way, right? So someone might define themselves as bisexual, whereas their twin defines themselves as pansexual, right? And so that wouldn't be concordance, but, would still fall under this. So yes, there is a genetic component, but there are environmental things that determine whether or not you're comfortable expressing it. All right, and this is an old poll, 2004. So this is the year I graduated college, so it's been a minute. And so even back then, I mean, it's not ancient times, but it's certainly been about 20 years, right? They thought that people who were gay, and again, now we use LGBTQ plus, should have equal rights in terms of job opportunities. They should have essentially the same rights as married couples. This was before gay marriage was legalized. And I think Massachusetts might have had it legalized by then, but they might have been the only ones. They should have health insurance rights, that they should have social security benefits, that they should have adoption rights. And it was kind of mixed in terms of whether they wanted to support marriage rights being recognized or not. It's really interesting because even though, 20 years ago, 18 years ago, people, almost 90% of people said, yeah, people who are LGBTQ plus should have the same job opportunities and working rights as we do. In a lot of states, and I believe Virginia is still one of them, they are called it's like right to work states. It's like the worst misnomer ever. And that basically means that your employer can fire you at will for any reason, including if they find out you're gay or trans or something along those lines. So again, even though we've been feeling pretty strong for a while that we shouldn't discriminate based on this, in a lot of places, it doesn't mean it's happening everywhere, but it's certainly a possibility without legal ramifications, which is obviously problematic. So, when the Supreme Court ruling was handed down that did sort of make same-sex marriage the law of the land, people were pretty excited, but there are a lot of these other rights that we still need to fight for. So things like lesbian couples who want to adopt, right? Especially religious organizations that are foster systems or what have you, often will not let them. And that's really sad to me because there are so many kids who need good homes, right? And if there's a loving family who's vetted and matches everything except that, like, why is that what's keeping these kids from getting out of the system? And so these are things to think about just in terms of how can we help these folks. A big thing is voting. So we do have local elections coming up if you're from Virginia. If you're not registered to vote, you can go to the Lighthouse and Wesleyan Engaged can help you get registered. They also provide driving to the polls on election day. And if you're not from here, make sure you request your absentee ballot. Alrighty, so here's a good, interesting question to think about. College students, and I think I would argue more and more high school students as well, will engage in risky sexual practices. So not using birth control, not using things to protect against STIs for a variety of reasons. What are some of the reasons why, do you think?
Like, I think high school, college, you're getting to the age where you want to start having a sexual relationship with someone, but whether it be like buying a condom or getting on birth control, it's out of the way to do.
Yeah.
It makes things easier to not use it. So
Yeah, if your parents are supportive, I mean, a lot of times when you're in high school, especially, right, you need a parent to go with you to go get something like birth control. So that can be really hard. Yeah, access to these things, right? I know that y'all's student government is making efforts to make condoms freely available on campus. I don't know how far along they are with that, but particularly after the Roe versus Wade overturning, they really wanted to at least make that step something that could be freely available. Other thoughts about why this might happen? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such a good point that like a lot of folks, and I mean, even like adults, right? My age, I mean, not that y'all aren't adults, you know what I mean? Older adults, there we go. Kind of think, yeah, like this won't ever happen to me. I won't get an STI. It's fine. I trust this person that I just met, right? I mean, and sometimes I think you're under the influence of something. So you don't necessarily, and it's not that you're so out of it that it's like a sexual assault, right? But to the point that like you just might not think of engaging in safe sex practices. Yeah. And so this, we'll skip over this because I have the answer right here. So, and this might be hard to read, but certainly feel free to go back and look at this later. I'm going to go ahead and again, make the font so it's actually legible. Novel concept. There we go. Okay, so I think when we think of birth control, we tend to think mostly of the pill, right? And those are probably one of the more common things that are used. As of right now, only people with uteruses can use them. They have been for years trying to work on a birth control pill for people with penises, but it keeps kind of getting delayed. And so one of the reasons that it gets delayed is because of the side effects. So when they came up with the female or the birth control pill for people with ovaries and uteruses, they didn't have as many ethical guidelines in place as we have now. And so, for example, I believe it was Puerto Rico, they just like gave it to a bunch of women and they were like, let's see what happens. And they had horrible side effects because the hormone levels were way too high. But no one was like, maybe we shouldn't do this. So now, because of the ethical guidelines we have, when men get the same symptoms, they stop the trial, right? Which is good, but can be frustrating. So we know that birth control pills can have some side effects. For some people, weight gain. For some people, feeling more or less emotional. Some people sort of feel like it flattens them, and same for sexual desire. But in general, this tends to be, if you take it the way it's supposed to be, so you take your pill every day at the same time, the failure rate is less than 1%. But given how people sometimes forget pills or things along those lines, the failure rate's actually about 8%. And that includes things like if you take antibiotics while you're on birth control, that can like cancel it out. That's how I was born. So things along that line could happen. The mini pill is only progesterone. The most birth control pills have a combination of hormones. And so it is a little less effective. It's saying it has the same effectiveness rate, but I certainly know someone who got pregnant on the mini pill, and not with just one someone's. It's often given to women who have really bad side effects with the combination birth pill, or women who are breastfeeding and who are not ready to have another kiddo yet, because it's okay if this ends up being secreted in breast milk. There are also injectables. So Depo-Provera is a shot you get, I believe it's like every 3 months. And this is very reliable. You don't need to worry about checking your pills every day, right? You sort of get it once and go through. Again, no protection from any of the things we've talked about so far against STDs. So they're just protecting against ovulation, basically, which is how they prevent against pregnancy. Again, here, it's not as bad, but you still have a 3% actual failure rate because people will like not schedule their next appointment on time and things along those lines. There's also the hormonal ring, like the NuvaRing. Again, this is reliable. You only have to do it once a week. but there's human error. And it's fairly new, so we still don't have data on like, what are the long-term effects of using it? There are also implants, you can get them like in your arm, that essentially do what these things do, but you don't have to take a pill, you don't have to switch your brain, you don't have to go every 3 months to get it checked on, right? And so these have, as you can see, some of the best effectiveness. They only fail 0.1% of the time. And that's just, people that, their bodies just, sometimes if your body just wants to get pregnant, it does, right? And there's things that we can't control. But again, no protection from STDs. There's also a patch you can wear that's similar to the ring in terms of how often you change it. And some people will have skin irritation with that, but otherwise it's pretty similar. One of the other more effective things is an IUD, intrauterine device. And so, yeah, a lot of people probably have them, right? So my understanding is they hurt like a bitch going in.
Yeah, they don't do, I mean, I have it, but they don't do anything.
Yeah, like no numbing, no anesthesia.
Like, oh, sorry, it's
Spitting
not
right on
intentional.
there.
Yeah, I've heard people like screaming, passing out, stuff like that. And I guess in other countries, they do use like a local anesthetic because they recognize it's painful. Here, they don't do it.
When men get what's it called
Vasectomy?
they offer like so much for them, like they offer them to like fully go under. But
Yeah, and y'all are not the first people I've heard that it's so painful. And actually, that was something like after I gave birth, they were like, "Well, you should just get an IUD." And I like, my husband and I had already decided we only wanted one kid. And I was like, I think it's your turn. So yeah, he did get a vasectomy, and it's interesting because it could be an outpatient procedure. Like we were like chatting with the doctor while he was doing it, right? But yeah, so IUDs can be really painful, but they're really effective. Yeah, and like I know Colorado, for example, for a while was doing these for free, and their birth rate went down for teens and women who didn't, and also their abortion rate went down because if you don't have people getting pregnant who don't want to be pregnant, then you don't have as many abortions, right? And so, yes, there is a little higher failure rate. Again, it's still under 1%, and that's just because these can like migrate sometimes, and then you have to go in and like fix them. But yes, then there are other barrier methods you can use. A diaphragm. So I don't know if anyone went to Dr. Casey and Dr. Slivka's talk yesterday, but they were talking about these being one of the more earlier forms of barrier birth control. But these have to be like fitted by a doctor. They're almost like a period cup, but like they go in and essentially like block off the cervix so nothing can get through. And you can use it with spermicide, which kills off the sperm so that they don't, even if they squeak by, they can't implant anything. Then condoms, they're both male and female condoms. These are great. They're cheap. And again, in some cases, they're readily available. But they break, right? And so they're, with true usage, they're actually only about 15 to 85, 80 to 85% effective, but obviously better than nothing. And we're going to protect against STIs. I mentioned my friend being sponge man. A sponge is similar to the diaphragm. It's something that would be inserted vaginally. And cervical caps similar to the diaphragm as well. You can just use spermicides. And they're not as effective if you don't also have a barrier method. And then a lot of people will try to use what's called the rhythm method, which is where you have the person who ovulates track their cycle, and then you don't, well, if you're trying to get pregnant, you do, but typically you don't have sex when they would be ovulating.
Is it even possible, this shows you how little public schools teach you, but is it even possible to get pregnant when you're not ovulating?
So yes, sperm can stay in your body for up to 5 days. So if you have sex like a couple days before you ovulate, in theory, you could still get pregnant. It's not common, but it could happen.
Just hanging out.
Yeah, that's just, chilling, hoping to bring an egg, Yeah, and I mean, just like things that like even I didn't learn, like the egg is an active part of it. Like it's not just the sperm burrows and like the egg protects sperm, which is kind of cool. But yeah, so you can get, and again, like if your cycle is irregular, this isn't gonna work. Obviously, so you need to kind of be careful. Same thing with withdrawal, trying to pull out before the person with the penis ejaculates. Not always great, right? We mentioned vasectomy. Women can also get what's called a tubal ligation, where you sort of tie off your fallopian tubes so that you can't ovulate anymore. And very extreme, often only done with other medical complications. You can also get what's called a hysterectomy, where you get like your whole uterus out. Typically, we don't just do that because that basically puts you into menopause. And if you're like 20, that can be a problem. Yeah, do not recommend using no contraceptive. Put it that way. All right, we have a couple more slides we'll bop through on Friday, and then we will start talking about personality, which is a really fun chapter.